Hello, I'm ZEINAB BADAWI. Welcome to Boston, Massachusetts for this special BBC World Debate. Boston is the home of the American movement to abolish the transatlantic slave trade in the 19th century. That may be a thing of the past, but sadly today, slavery still exists all over the world. Millions of men, women and children are being forced to work as labourers, domestic servants or prostitutes for little or no pay. Why does the world allow this tragedy to continue, and what can we do about it? Well, that's what we're going to be doing here today, discussing this here at MIT in Boston, Massachusetts. Well, to discuss this here today, we have Stephen Law, who is US Deputy Labour Secretary, Kevin Bales, one of the world's leading anti-slavery campaigners, Roger Plant, author of a report by the International Labour Organization spearheading a campaign to eradicate forced labour, Professor JAGDISH BHAGWATI from Columbia University, and Jean-Robert Cadet, a freed slave from Haiti, who now describes himself as a middle-class American. Welcome to you all. Jean-Robert Cadet, it is estimated that even today, 1 in 10 children in Haiti is a child slave known as a restavek. You were one yourself. Describe to us what kind of life you had.
I became a restavek when I was 4 years old. I was given to a woman who lived in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. As a restavek, I slept under the kitchen table. That was my place in the home. And at 5:30 in the morning, my duties would entail sweeping the yard in the morning, washing the car, doing the dishes, going to the market, and then, of course, there's a problem of water. And I would spend a great many hours during the daytime fetching water, and the water for to clean the house, to do the laundry. And in the afternoon, I would wash the adults' feet. They would sit under the tree in the yard, and I would wash their feet. And at night, washing the dishes again, set the table for dinner, lunch, breakfast. And then you have the beating coming to that. The biggest part of being a restavek is the emotional detachment. There is no emotional ties with the family. As a restavek, I called everybody in the house as Mr., Mademoiselle, even the children who were a lot younger than I was.
So you were just treated as subhuman?
Yes. Even the children, I addressed the children as Mr. And as a restavek child, I was borrowed by neighbors to go to the market, or borrowed by the neighbors to walk their children to school. And that's one of the biggest duties for restavek children.
So you were a restavek from the age of 4 till about 14, 15, and finally when you were brought to the United States, you managed to escape?
Until I was 16 years old, I came to I was smuggled into the United States with false papers. And when the family realized that the restavek problem, the restavek lifestyle was not conducive to American society, I was basically let go. I was kicked out of the house.
Stephen Law, you are the US Deputy Labour Secretary. There are 1 million Haitians living in the United States today. Are you confident that there aren't any more restavek child slaves working at this very moment in time in the United States?
Well, it's something that we're very concerned about at the Department of Labor, and one of the things that we focus a lot on is where people, particularly immigrants, particularly low-wage, low-skilled workers, are in situations or in parts of the economy where they would be subject to exploitation or being poorly treated. And one of the things we do is we train our wage and hour investigators, people who go out to make sure that people are being paid appropriate wages, so that they can look out for those signs of intimidation, coercion, secrecy, things that would tip them off.
But these aren't people being paid wages, are they? These
are
children who should be in school, who are being treated as slaves, possibly right under your very noses.
Well, and that's the reason for the training, ZEINAB, is we want to make sure that when we go into situations where we might find simple violations of our wage laws, that there could also be evidence of other things that would lead us to see that there's actual exploitation, child labor, things like that that are very much against our laws that we want to eradicate.
Kevin Bales, I mean, Jean-Robert describes the kind of traditional form of slavery that we are used to talking about. Does that kind of chattel slavery still exist in other parts of the world, in Africa, for instance?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Very large numbers of people caught up in hereditary forms of slavery across Central
Africa, Western Africa as well, into the Middle East. And then really, even forms of debt bondage in South Asia tend to be hereditary. The debt bonds may seem like a car loan to an American, but in fact it's more like putting your whole family as collateral against a loan, and that because your work is also part of that collateral, you're never able to pay it back. And it means that, well, I've met families in India in their 4th and 5th generation of enslavement against an original debt of as little as $10. Let me say, though, that sadly, the U.S. government has got good laws and good wage and hour inspectors, but we need to expand the frame of those laws, because not all U.S. labor law will extend to those most irregular parts of the economy.
Are you concerned that there are, for example, Haitian children being used as slaves in the U.S. today? I mean, do you have any idea?
Can I point to one? No. But can I say that we have found people in exactly the same situation that Jean Robert faced in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., young women from Ghana, from the Cameroon, from the Ivory Coast, who are actually called by the people who control them the creature, the animal, and used for years and sexually abused as well as domestic servants in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. Cases just like that. Now, if it's happening in Washington, D.C., we found in 90 cities in the United States people caught up in forced labor. So, yes, it is.
Professor Jagdish Bhagwati, I mean, you are a native of India. Would you describe the bonded labour in the terms that Kevin Bales does as basically tantamount to slavery?
Oh, I think it's definitely true that there's a vast amounts of bonded labour, and the government has been trying to address that issue. The Supreme Court had a famous judgment which actually freed bonded slaves in the specific case, and it's been much cited and has energized the NGOs. I think it is as a panelist pointed out, a situation where we've inherited it, and I think from my perspective, the different forms of coercive labor or forced labor have very different dimensions. Something like bonded labor predates anything like the modern age, post-independence and so on.
Roger Plant, so Jagdish Bhagwati there describing how complex and varied what we can call modern-day slavery is. But what do you think are the conditions that are necessary in order for us to be able to define it as slavery?
Well, we in the International Labour Organization, we have two basic criteria. Firstly, you don't enter a job or a service of your own free choice. And secondly, you can't get out of that without some form of penalty. A lot of this is deception. A lot of it is people expecting to find a work in decent conditions, but they're always deceived. They're deceived at the place of origin, deceived at the place of deception. But those are essentially the two basic points. Lack of free will to get in, impossibility to get out without a penalty.
And what's your figure for the number of people who are in modern-day slavery?
We have just done a global estimate of forced labor today. We have found there are 12.3 million victims of forced labor around the globe. Of these, just over 9.5 million are in Asia, so it's very largely an Asian problem. But the key issue is that this is a problem all over the globe. We have 1.3 billion in Latin America, just over 600,000 in Africa, and importantly, we have 360,000 in the industrialized countries. The second key point is that we tend to think that forced labor is something imposed by states. We associate it with gulags, with Pol Pot's Cambodia or Kampuchea. But today, 4/5 of all forced laborers are suffering the forced labor is imposed by private agents, so it's not directly by the state.
Jean Robert, but I want to ask you this, a lot of people might say, why didn't you run away when you were a Restavek child slave in Haiti? You must have had many opportunities. Was there something that kept you within the household?
It's the same reason slaves, a lot of slaves don't run away. Or run away where? Where do you go? Especially for children who find themselves in slavery. You see other children like yourselves in the neighborhood. And then you see other children who are different from you. So you accepted the lifestyle as normal. I thought this was normal for me as a child, getting up at 5:30 in the morning, washing a pile of laundry that the women use in the house to control their monthly period. And that was, to me, that was normal. That's what Restavek children did. And where would I go?
Kevin Bales, I mean, that's something you do find, don't you? In Mauritania, you've worked there and looked at how slaves just see themselves as domesticated animals. They choose to remain. You've seen young girls being used as prostitutes and not choosing to leave their brothels. It's quite complex. I mean, how can you help these people?
Well, it is complex, but let's be clear. Slaves, given the choice, will almost always choose to leave. It's only those people who are caught up in slavery, in usually hereditary situations, who know no other life beyond the boundary of the place in which they've been enslaved, who find it very difficult to step out. But given the tiniest amount of information, the tiniest glimmer of freedom on their horizon, and they will take a step toward it. So that the young women that you mentioned in Thailand were held through force. They would pay a penalty, according to the ILO's definition.
You've written about, for example, how some of them go home, visit their families in the countryside, and they still choose to go back to the brothels, and that some of them take a dark pride in the large price that they command.
A very serious dimension of, over time, psychological enslavement. Those young women have been sexually abused, sleep-deprived, malnourished, and suffered terrible physical abuse as well. In time, they come, it's called Stockholm Syndrome. It happened in Nazi concentration camps. They come to identify with the very oppressors who control them. And they know that that's the person who can either make their life hell or make their life slightly better.
I would just add, too, I think there's a certain amount of cultural reinforcement that then locks people into that kind of a lifestyle. We met with a group of rescued bonded laborers when we were in India. And what really struck me when we talked to these men and women and even children who were held in a bonded labor conditions in a brick kiln was that they were very, very concerned about living up to what they viewed as their responsibilities under what was clearly a deceptive and punitive debt arrangement. They were very concerned about living up to society's norms and expectations, and that contributed to the imprisonment they felt. And it wasn't until they met with somebody who happened to chance upon them who said, there's a way that we can rescue you from this. There are actually laws on the books in India that prohibit this kind of practice, that they began to see that there was a hope for freedom and a reason to escape, and it was not something for which they would suffer social opprobrium.
But human trafficking, which Kevin Bales was talking about, I mean, where you see young women and children coming to the industrialized world, the rich world. I mean, this is a crime, but the fact of the matter is the United States spends more combating drug trafficking than it does human trafficking. Can that be right?
It's clearly a huge issue that we are stepping up to, and I think the most important thing that we can do, psychologists will always tell you that the first step to ending a problem is to admit the problem, and the United States government has taken great steps to deal with the fact that there is human trafficking that goes on in the United States as well as around the world. As the ILO report, the International Labor Organization report shows, it's a fairly small issue in the industrialized nations, but we are a marketplace where trafficked people are sent, and it's something that we need to step up to more aggressively.
Roger Pond, is it poverty that drives people into a kind of slave-like situation, the poor young girls in northern Thailand, children in Africa?
Forced labor certainly thrives where there is poverty. There's no question that if we're looking in terms of numbers, then most of the forced labor is in the poor countries, it's in the poor regions. It's predominantly women and children. More than half of all victims are women and children. However, we as International Labour Organization will always insist that not only does forced labor thrive where there is poverty, but forced labor creates extreme poverty. It creates extreme poverty and it creates oppression. What is happening is that those who exploit bonded labor are making profits, sometimes significant profits in the national context, at the expense of the most vulnerable groups, including the undercaste, the scheduled caste, the outcast, the Dalits in society. And this is the case everywhere. So you cannot say that forced labor can only be overcome when poverty is overcome. You've got to realize that efforts have to be targeted at those victims, and it's only by overcoming forced labor that you can actually overcome extreme poverty.
JAGDISH BHAGWATI, you've written eloquently in defense of globalization. When you hear this kind of thing going on, does it make you think twice? This is the dark underside of globalization, people seeking profits from the sweat and tears of human beings?
No, I think if you look at the problem historically, like the creation of slavery at the source that was deeply tied into globalization, because you had sugar plantations, etc., in the West Indies. That was directly tied into sugar trade. There was no domestic market, no domestic institutions of the kind which have been characterizing forced bonded labor. But today, I would say, I would add to what has been gone before by saying that, particularly if you focus on bonded labor, what is it that, aside from the legislation and the judicial activism which we have in India, which are important things, but in the end, increasing prosperity is important. Like when you freed the slaves, for example, they would have probably gone back, or some of them went back. You look at the Soviet Union going into perestroika. A lot of people were still wanting to go back to the security, even though the life was, much worse and inefficient. They were risk-averse. So you have to change the institutions and the possibilities. That needs heavy lifting. And part of the increased incomes, which really enable people to find new jobs, etc., that is something tied into globalization in turn.
Kevin Bales, you've written about how caste and ethnicity and tribal group actually isn't relevant. But when you hear what Jagdish Bhagwati says, and we know that bonded labourers in India are mostly made up of people from the lower caste, it is relevant.
I've never said that it wasn't relevant. What I was saying is not a legal determining factor as it was in the past. Many people hold ideas of slavery today locked in the 19th century. So they're saying, well, if you were an African, then you were enslavable. Today, those memberships of groups, like being a Dalit or being part of a lower caste group in India, is an indicator of your vulnerability, is an indicator.
But it's more than that. Bonded labourers, 86% of them are from the Dalit or tribal
and that's
minority
because
groups.
of their extreme economic vulnerability. But there are also a handful of Dalits who do well. You can't enslave someone just because they're Dalit. It has to be because they lack the power to do so. But I wanted to come back to what Roger was saying about the role of coming out of slavery and how that can actually be a very positive economic move. And it is not about necessarily even finding new jobs, because one of the things slaves know how to do, we find this so much in our work around the world, they know how to work. Work is what they know. It's about putting them in a situation in which their work can serve them. And we find that every village that we work with in northern India, for example, that comes out of bonded labor becomes its own economic dynamo. Because for the first time, all of their proceeds, all of their labor is not being harvested by a slave master. It's actually returning to them. And it's fascinating and it's beautiful, because those people who come out of slavery, the first thing they do is build a school with their money. The first thing they do is build a school. Not even food so much, but a school for their kids. And then they go to food and clothing and so forth. They become consumers.
But Kevin, I think we have to be careful on this. It's true that when former forced laborers or slaves are empowered, they can definitely look after themselves. They can definitely solve their own problems. But what we're finding is the victims of forced labor today are nearly always assetless people on the move. They're totally the most vulnerable people, and they have nothing to go back to. And this is why we always insist that in order to overcome, to get rid finally of forced labor, we think it can be done. We think it can be one of the major goals of all of us, which is why we're calling for this global alliance over the next 10 years. You have to combine prevention, reintegration, and combating impunity and law enforcement.
That's important, because law enforcement is one of the first critical steps you have to take either to make sure that strong laws are in place, or if they are already in place like they are in India, to make sure that there's a sustained commitment to enforce those laws. But at the same time, particularly if you take child laborers, where we've been involved with the International Labor Organization in removing children from exploitive and hazardous conditions in India. If you simply remove them, you do almost nothing for them, because they're not ready to go to school yet, and very quickly they'll find themselves in another exploitive situation. And so one of the things that we've spent a long time doing is working to create transitional educational opportunities, or if they're older, to create vocational opportunities, so that people who are rescued from bonded or other exploitive labor conditions can actually make the move to self-dependence and to a better life for themselves and their families.
But it's not so easy, is it, Stephen Law? If you look at what's gone on in the United States, where you've got 26 million African Americans, many of them the descendants of slaves, and you see that to this day, decades after slavery was abolished, that they still form a disproportionate number of the country's unemployed and disaffected. It's not easy, is it?
It takes a tremendous amount of effort and a sustained commitment over time. And in fact, the same conditions can be found in certain parts of rural Appalachia where people were locked in exploitive labor contracts in the timber industry many, many decades ago.
But do you accept that the legacy of slavery in the United States is so strong that the scars are still there, that it still governs people's lives in that they feel that they are still paying the price?
I think there's a tremendous complexity to the issue comparing what happened well over 150 years ago to today. But nevertheless, I think some of the pathologies, certainly that slavery began, took a very, very long time to work out through our country.
But that psychology is still there. Jean-Robert, I know you have many friends and associates. You're now a teacher in Cincinnati, Ohio, and you know many African Americans. Does this feeling of this slave legacy still haunt them to the extent that they feel that they are still in some way deprived?
Absolutely. Not only the legacy of slavery, also the legacy of the Jim Crow laws that dictate their lives for over 100 years. You have situations where, in poor black neighborhoods, once the blacks started to move to a better neighborhood where white people live, what the whites do, they keep moving away. Now you have a situation where not only I live in Cincinnati, you have a very polarized society, but you wonder where will the white eventually wind up? Because the blacks keep following them, and then the whites keep trying to move away.
This is where the ILO report is so important, because the United States historically serves as the perfect negative example of what not to do when people come to freedom. We botched the emancipation of 1865. We dumped 4 million people into an economy without assets, without political participation, without education. And it meant that we're still paying the price for that botched emancipation. And the ILO report...
What price? What price?
Well, it's the price of, first, systematic discrimination, segregation, lack of opportunity, and that repeats itself generation through generation to the present situation that Jean-Robert describes. But the ILO report's important because it doesn't just tell us that there are a number of people in the world in situations of slavery and forced labor. In the last part of the report, it says very clearly, here are important steps to take with national governments to avoid the kind of fiasco that occurred here in 1865. It was a long time ago. They made mistakes. But we do not want to make those mistakes.
JAGDISH Bhagwati, just briefly address this point, which is even if you have all the right laws in place, if people are being discriminated against or being seen as being suitable for forced labour, bonded labour, simply because they are, for example, members of a particular caste, the Dalits, it doesn't matter how many laws you have. If it's deeply embedded in cultural and social values and it's gone on for millennia, how can you get rid of it?
Well, I think you're raising a very good question, but I think essentially social institutions themselves can change as a result of economic and other incentives because of laws which you've passed. The essential point, I think, to me is that you can have all the good laws, as some of our friends on the panel were saying, but they have to kick in, meaning they have to be implemented. And that's where the institutions matter, like having a democratic system where NGOs can flourish, but opposition parties can flourish. They can turn the aspirations of the Dalits and so on into politically effective demands in your system. You have to be able to, if you walk away from and get your freedom, you have to be able then to find new jobs, which is where economic prosperity, aided and abetted by globalization, matters.
Roger Plant, so enforcing the law isn't always necessarily the right answer?
Yeah, but there are 3 points I'd like to make quickly. First, we recognize that. First, we have found that India's had excellent legislation since 1976, Nepal since a couple of years ago. Now we are finding that when bonded laborers are released, there are many cases when they're relapsing, they're falling back into bonded labor situations because there is no effective reintegration. They're not being given the opportunity, they're not being given the assets. However, if we look at Brazil, Brazil is a country which has taken global leadership in fighting forced labor in a multifaceted way. And we've realized that you must combat impunity. If you don't have effective law enforcement, there's nothing else that you can do. And so we would really congratulate the government of Brazil. We found that there have been some 2,000 prosecutions in recent times. And this is actually making an impact, but this is being complemented with naming and shaming and also with some effective reintegration measures.
Have you really done as much naming and shaming as you could? I mean,
we don't name and shame. That's
you
not,
don't
that's,
name and
that's,
shame, but
that's
shouldn't
not,
you?
That's
But
not our
shouldn't
job.
you, Roger Plant? I mean, you work too much.
Our job
Let me
is
say to you, you work too much within the niceties of the United Nations, where you don't want to embarrass nations. But should you not name and shame countries who are not implementing anti-trafficking, anti-child labour, forced labour laws, and say to them, you've got to stop this? Why aren't you doing that?
It is not our specific job. Our job is to set the framework to cooperate with our governments and our social partners to provide the broad picture. But when the government takes that...
So whose job is it then?
It can be NGOs, it can be civil society, it can be governments, as in the case of Brazil.
But you work with NGOs, you work with non-governmental organisations, with international labour
We work mainly with our own partners, which is worker organisations, with business, and also with governments.
So why aren't you speaking up for them then?
We are speaking up for them.
But obviously not sufficiently enough, because, I mean, who's heard of the ILO?
We are speaking up. We have to work with governments, but we do have a project which is working very, very actively with the government of Brazil and is helping them. It's been actively involved in a campaign which has been naming and shaming certain companies. We think that's very positive. But I want to finish what I was saying before, because when we're talking about law enforcement, and we say that the legal framework is there, we have insisted in this report that in many cases the legal framework is not there enough, because the new forms of forced labour are not being captured. They're not being captured. We're finding that most victims of forced labour in the industrialized world are migrant workers. Now, sometimes, as in the case of the US with its 2000 Act, there is very good anti-trafficking legislation, but not all victims of forced labour have actually been trafficked. That's the first
Stephen Law,
thing.
no, just stop there. Stephen Law, I mean, anti-trafficking measures, you see it quite often more as a kind of immigration issue, migration. You send people back if you do find them. But this is a crime against humanity.
It is very much so, and I think one very important point that needs to be made is that there really are two kinds of slavery today. There's the traditional form that Kevin talked about earlier, where you have a kind of traditional, long-held, sometimes generational bonded labor that is tied into the local economic fabric and culture and society. And then increasingly we have a much more modern form of slavery, which is tied to our very globalized world now. A lot more transmigration of people, immigration, people being removed from situations and cultures and communities where they felt safe, being held against their will and sometimes in deceptive situations. And it's a very new kind of slavery that we're dealing with that sometimes requires different kinds of measures. But you're absolutely right, it is tied to the migration of people and to immigration, but it involves labor conditions and situations that are very much a crime and need to be treated as such.
Kim Bales?
Well, I think the important thing that ties some of this together that we haven't actually touched on is the new news about contemporary forms of forced labor and slavery, and that is the dramatic fall in the cost of enslaving a human being. If we went back to Alabama in 1850, the cost of a slave was about $1,000 in 1850 money. That's $40,000 in today's economy. Today, around the world, a bonded laborer can be bonded for $30, $40, $50. In Thailand, in a few hundred, even in the United States, 1,000. It kind of the cost of taking a person into a situation of forced labor has hit rock bottom. Slaves are bargain basement items today, and that means that they have become much more likely to be enslaved for very short periods because they're disposable. They're like this little plastic cup. I'm going to use it and then I'm going to throw it away, and that's happening to people today.
Jean-Robert, I mean...
Well, one thing I wanted to mention was the fact that we're talking about the laws. Haiti has laws on the books, laws about child slavery and laws about forced labor. According to the laws in Haiti, the laws that govern child slavery, no one is allowed to take a child under the age of 12 as a domestic slave. But the Haitian government does not produce a birth certificate to its poor children. So you find children who are as young as 6 years old, some 4, 5, 6 years old, in domestic slavery.
But that's the government turning a blind eye to it, because a 4-year-old can't masquerade as a 12-year-old.
That's right, yeah. But not only that, Haiti has a constitution that was actually, the U.S. government had a hand in this constitution. The United States government helped write this Haiti's constitution. In the constitution today, Article 32 of the Haitian constitution says that school is mandatory at government expense for every child.
Do you want assistance?
The U.S. government, the U.S. government is the biggest donor of foreign aid to Haiti. And I have been trying hard. I've even appeared at the Senate in 2000, asking that foreign aid be linked directly to the elimination of child slavery in Haiti.
And did you get any?
No, of course not.
I mean,
it's not going to happen.
Haiti is in your backyard.
Haiti is right there in America's backyard. The U.S. Embassy is huge. It's almost, it takes the entire block near the National Palace of Haiti. The U.S. government, the people who work at the embassy in Haiti, they see every day thousands of children walking other children to school. And the children who walk others to school, they don't go to school themselves, but the Constitution that the U.S. government helped write says every child is guaranteed an education at government expense.
What do you feel? What do you feel when you hear that?
What I want to ask is, what is the one most effective intervention that the U.S. government could take to deal with that issue? And the reason I ask that is that I would think there would be tremendous concern if the United States government were to move to withdraw all foreign aid to Haiti on the basis of that or any other reason. So I'm just asking, what is the one effective intervention that we should pursue? I didn't say
removing foreign aid. I said linking foreign aid to the elimination of child slavery.
Right.
When Aristide fell, the United States government said, Bush himself said, I want, according to the Haitian Constitution, the chief of the Supreme Court should be in power. Guess what happened? Within 24 hours, he was in power.
Why can't you do that? I mean,
the United States government has the strongest voice in Haiti.
Exactly.
Can end this tomorrow if they want to.
Right, but here's my concern.
No, it's not going to happen.
But here's my concern. I think if you decide to threaten you're going to withdraw foreign aid if child labor isn't eliminated and child labor is not eliminated, what should the federal government do at that point? That's my question and my concern. And the other thing I would say in addition to that is where we have found the most effectiveness in dealing with child labor or bonded labor in different countries is when we can get the cooperation of the governments that they themselves recognize that it's an issue that needs to be addressed, and we can link arms together very typically with the international.
You have a voice in Haiti. You've intervened in Haitian politics. You've had top government officials visit the country. Why can you not do what Jean-Robert Cadet is saying here, to use that clout to help those children?
But I think once again what's required is an indigenous voice that says this is the local institution building that is going on that's going to deal with that issue, because once again you can issue threats, you can issue ultimatums, but if there's simply no resource within to deal with the problem, it will not be dealt with. And it looks like Kevin's going to speak as well, so I don't want to cut off, but I think it's very, very important to look at the areas where we've had tremendous success, like Brazil and like India, where we've had joint partnerships with both sides coming to the table with infrastructure involved and committed, local law enforcement, local employers stepping up to the plate and being willing to deal with the issue, and a combined effort that then yields the result.
Right. Kevin Bill?
Well, just to say, it's right. We don't have to hit countries with sticks first. Let's hold out some carrots first. But the trouble is the government's not even holding out the carrots. Haiti is just indicative of what's going on around the world, in that the U.S. government has begun to do good things, set some good standards, put a list on human trafficking in which they put countries into tears about how well they're doing in their fight against trafficking, linking that to potential trade sanctions and so forth. Now, the push is going to come to shove in the next year when Japan, which has not done well in fighting human trafficking, comes up for review as a potential trade sanction partner. It was one thing to do it to Sudan, from whom we get almost nothing. But to talk about Japan and say, what are we going to do there?
About the sex slaves in Japan, that's what you're talking about.
The more than 100,000 young women a year brought in under entertainer visas under Japan. It's a wide open door to human trafficking in Japan. I've just returned from Japan, and they will not fix this problem. They will not pass a law against it, and it needs to be fixed.
Roger Plant, at the end of the day, where does the true momentum and initiative lie? Do you need the sort of grassroots activists like Jean-Robert Cadet, who works very hard now to help the street children and Restavex in Port-au-Prince now? Is that where it is to need them?
Absolutely. You need it, and we owe it to the grassroots activists. We owe it to them to work with them. We must always work with the victims, for the victims, and be led by the victims as well. But it's always across the spectrum. We are lucky in a way that we are an intergovernmental organization. We've got business working with us, we've got workers in our structure, and we've got governments in our structure.
But do you speak up for those campaigners, like the leading anti-slavery campaigner in Niger, who was going to liberate 7,000 slaves in a massive ceremony, and what happens? The government arrests him. I mean, do you speak up? Have you said this is a case that should be brought to the world's attention? Can you do that?
We have our structure in the ILO. This has not come directly to us. We can only act when information reaches us through our workers' organisations, through governments.
But we all know about this. We all know about this situation. I mean, whose duty is it to speak up for that kind of campaigner when they're harassed in their own country?
We need an Amnesty International type arrangement to point to grassroots workers. Our organization, our sister organization, Anti-Slavery International, was supporting that worker in Niger, you know, we can point to people who are not just injured, who are martyrs to this. People who have worked with us who have been killed in India for trying to bring people out of bonded labor. But the average person in the North, in the developed world, knows nothing about these martyrs to the fight against slavery. And we need to begin to bring them to the fore. And it's tricky to do it from the ILO's perspective, because they work to state governments, national.
So they want to mind what they say?
Well, it's not just that, but their rules say they have to work on information that comes from employers, trade unions, or national governments.
I would just say, too, that when we last went to India, one of the things that we made a point of doing was reversing the usual order of official visits. Typically, you go to the capital city and you meet with officials, and then you go out and do your side visits. And we made a point of doing our side visits first, and we talked to bonded laborers who had been rescued in Chennai, and we talked to rescued victims of sex trafficking in Mumbai. And so that when we went to visit with the officials in the national government, we were able to communicate facts that we had actually seen and reports that we had gathered from indigenous non-government organizations on the ground. And as a result of that, we were able to get a great deal more expression of concern and interest by senior officials, because they knew that we were not simply speaking from some notes we'd read in a book, but they were the actual people we'd met and touched and listened to.
JAGDISH BHAGWATI, does the consumer actually have the ability to have an impact on this question of forced labour? Can they vote with their money in a way and say, we are not going to buy products from the developing world unless we can be certain that there hasn't been a child forced to make this?
Well, I think we can have an impact, most definitely, by flagging the issue and making people much more conscious of it. Whether a boycott is essentially, which is what you're talking about, really works, will depend on how widespread the problem is. Because if you do it for specific commodities which are being exported, produced with forced labor, people will just shift into other activities. Domestic activities, some of these are huge markets like Brazil, India, and so on. So the instrument of boycott is good for flagging the issue or the problem, but not flogging it, and unless you can cover a whole range of activities, which is going to be very hard to do for consumer boycotts.
Consumers can absolutely make a difference, but not necessarily by what they buy in the marketplace. The point is that the total number of people in forced labor, some 12 million, probably almost certainly more than that, represent a very small part of the global workforce. The products that they make flow into very complex chains that reach the consumer. The consumer would like to take the slavery out of the product by making a choice in a shopping mall. But in fact, the place to take slavery out of that product is back on the farm, 14 steps down the product chain, where it actually occurs. So if the choice is to buy a shirt or not buy a shirt, the answer is don't buy the shirt, but give the money you would have spent to an organization that's going to fight the slavery at its point of origin. That's the way a consumer can make a difference. We'd like to do it by buying this product over that, but in fact the most efficient way is to put your money where your mouth is, and make sure that the slavery stops where it starts, not at the end of a very long product chain. There's a place for product chain work as well, but first let's take the slavery off the farm where it really occurs.
And I would just simply add, as the International Labor Organization report showed us, and I think very valuably, a great deal of what is produced through bonded labor or other forms of forced labor actually never directly enters the global supply chain. A lot of it is a very localized market for very localized goods, things such as bricks, beady cigarettes in India, glassware, rock quarry work, as well as domestic work, which is almost by definition very localized. I think the best thing that we can do, and it's part of what this conference is doing very valuably, is to raise people's awareness about the issue and raise their level of concern so that in a very much broader way, working with other governments, we can begin to tackle this problem effectively right at the roots, which is what Kevin said and completely agree with.
Well, awareness is good, but we got to put some money to it.
Right, no, that's true.
We've got to put some money to it. But there's been a lot of talk. But, you know, all the money that's spent by the U.S. government and almost all the other Western governments on this issue comes to something under the cost of one B-1 bomber, right? Less than $1 billion gets spent on this.
So you think with more money we could do something?
How do you solve problems? First you have to raise awareness, of course, and know what the problem is. You can't solve it if you don't understand it. But then it takes some resources to crack this problem. One of the things that we do know from work in the field is that it's not an expensive problem to solve. Bonded labor families in northern India, we've just worked toward their freedom over several years, several thousand of them. We just did our accounting. It worked out to $32 per family, not paying off their debt, not buying them out of slavery. The cost of managing the projects, $32 a family.
Jean-Robert, I mean, we all know what the consumer boycott against apartheid did, and that's all. Would you, now that you are a prominent campaigner against child slavery, would you like to have consumers in with you, supporting your movements?
Well, but the problem in Haiti is very unique, that the children, they don't produce a product. They don't make a product. These kids are domestic slaves in the backyard of their owners.
All right, would awareness, public awareness internationally help you?
Public awareness works, but you have to have some punch behind your public awareness. For example, I mentioned earlier that I testified in front of the Senate about what's going on in Haiti. Promise was made, but promises are not kept.
Okay, Roger Plant, I mean, when one looks at it, you do feel some kind of despair. You see organizations like Anti-Slavery International and Free the Slaves and Anti-Slavery International Forces, the oldest human rights organization in the world, around since 1839, the ILO. And then you say to yourself, why, when you've got all these people working, trying to eradicate modern forms of slavery, does it still persist that we're talking in the millions?
I'm absolutely not pessimistic. We are completely optimistic. We feel, as Kevin has said and as Stephen has said as well, we feel this has not been enough on international radar screens of human rights, development organizations, anybody, or including the international financial institutions. We feel that it's imperative to support organizations like Anti-Slavery International and Free the Slaves. We think they do a great job, they do a necessary job, they're working at the grassroots level. We do some of this, but we think NGOs do some things better than we do. And we know that, we all know that. But we also feel that this is what our global alliance is all about. It is to get resources, it is to get business on board, it is to, some things we're not talking about, some things require very difficult policy decisions. And you've got to get business and workers and government to talk about these subcontracting chains, which are fomenting the new forced labour in many areas.
And the aim is to eradicate all this by 2015.
We can. It's not an impossible task because the numbers are not impossibly great. We were talking several years ago about 250,000 child labourers. If we're talking, we know this is a conservative estimate, but we feel it is. It really focuses minds. Finally, that's the first time an international organization is giving these numbers out. We can focus, we can know where it is, and we can know that with a combination of law enforcement and effective prevention and rehabilitation strategies, bringing other people on board, bringing the World Bank on board on its poverty reduction, we can do something.
One of the most important accelerators as well is the move to a globalized economy. I think it's very significant that this conference is called forced labor in a global economy because it is bringing us closer together. It is forcing us onto the same stage together and to share each other's problems and to work together to solve them.
Got to leave it there, gentlemen. So perhaps a question mark still hangs over whether we will really be able to eradicate slavery in its various forms by 2015, but what we've all agreed here, our panel says that with the political will and the resources behind it, it can be eradicated, as everybody wants to, by 2015. Thank you to all my panel, and thank you to you for watching. For now, from me, ZEINAB BADAWI from Boston, Massachusetts. Goodbye. stay in place, everybody.
Thank you.